Good morning, everyone. Real pleasure. Thank you so much, Carlos, for that and very inspiring reflections of how you got to where you are and what keeps you there. I know that you all have been sitting for a few hours, so I'm going to make the executive decision that I get to do and ask you all to stand up for just a few seconds, do a little stretching, right? I should have worn a different dress if I was going to do this. But I'll give you the sense of what you're meant to be doing, right? All right. Good. And I feel a little bit better, stretch. Do a little cactus arms, maybe. Who here is an aficionado of yoga? Nicole. We know Nicole. Oh, we have a lot of hands going up. All right. So you're the owners of your own practice. Give yourself a little stretch. Okay. All right. Great. Well, now you can sit back down. So we are in for a real treat this morning. I had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time with our next speaker who traveled a good distance, like many of you did, to be able to be here. And I think we're really he's going to find a way to connect the themes of purpose and fulfillment and meaning that we talked about today and this morning, and to how he talks about his journey. So we're very, very pleased to have Dr. Vas Narasimhan here, who's the CEO of Novartis. He joined the firm 14 years ago, and in that time has been either the US head, the North America head, or the global head of just everything. So he's gone through a lot of really very important positions. And he became CEO last February. So it's been a little bit over a year and a bit. And so the transformation and the work that he's going to describe to you is both reflecting what he's done in his first year, but also what the arc has been for the company. So we're just really, really thrilled to have Vas here to speak with us. And so he's going to come talk, give some reflections, then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So thank you.
So it's great to be here. Always great to come back to Boston, a place I really think of as home. Maybe what Lauren didn't mention is my roots here go quite deep, also even to Peru. I built a strong sense of purpose in this town by starting out working with Paul Farmer and Jim Kim, I think two of the great pioneers of public health of recent memory. I worked with them long before they were well-known names, I think, in the Boston medical community. But it's through them, work in Africa, work with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis patients in Peru, I work with HIV/AIDS and malaria. I developed a deep passion and belief that ultimately purpose-driven organizations are the ones that have remarkable impact on the world. So in becoming CEO of a company like Novartis with 100,000 extraordinary people, I began a journey with the company to ask, how could we really create a purpose-driven company? And a big part of that for us, in terms of really creating shared value in the world, is reimagining access to medicines. Now, when you look at the world and you look at the history of human health, I think this graph is a remarkable graph. For most of the 2 million years that hominids, or various species of the Homo sapiens, have been on the planet, life was brutal and short. For most of that time, you can see, for as far back as we have the data, life expectancy was around 40 years of age. Most people had no concept of illness or medicine. It was only 100 years ago, roughly, we began to see a remarkable thing happen. We began to be able to bend the curve of life. We began to create the possibility that people could live into their 70s, 80s, or 90s. And you can see what the remarkable trajectory has been. What I find especially remarkable on this graph is when you look at a place like Tanzania. I've had the opportunity to work in Tanzania in the public health system. And you look now, as of 2065 years, actually, if you go fast forward, the life expectancy now of Tanzania is into the 70s. Stephen Radelet, an economist, said that one of the greatest human accomplishments in modern history is the improvements of health and life expectancy in the poorer parts of the world. And most of us don't even realize it's happening. So a remarkable amount of impact healthcare, medicine has had. Now, when I look at our company in that same frame, we've had a journey over 250 years to be part of that. We started out as a dye-making company, really pioneering dyes and exporting them from across the Rhine River. For most of the 1800s, we were a chemicals company, along with our counterparts in Basel. And then in the early 1900s, we realized that chemistry was really the basis of medicine. We became one of the largest medicines producers in the world over the subsequent century, working on a range of topics, whether it's anti-infectives or antibiotics, malaria control. Our work on malaria control goes all the way back to the 1930s. So we've had a long legacy of trying to be part of that incredible journey to bend the curve of life. Today, our company is quite large. We have approximately 100,000 associates. We reach about 750 million patients with our medicines, 155 countries where we have operations. We also started to try to calculate what is the impact, what is the value creation of our company. And you can see some of the numbers here. Our goal in areas like the environment is to make a dramatic step forward, to get to a place where we're carbon neutral by 2025, that we're plastic and water neutral in the same period. And so really our goal is to measure ourselves on the impact we create across a range of parameters. Also, whether it's human rights, where we have been leaders in trying to be about human rights and signing up for the various conventions. Equal pay, where we've committed to get to a place of equal pay. Gender diversity in our leadership. I mean, really across the spectrum, we take that if we can be a responsible company, it ultimately serves the greater good. What's not on this slide is we produce 70 billion doses of medicine a year. We are the largest producer of medicine by volume in the world, because we have the second largest generics company in our company. Now, what I'd like to talk to you about is our journey on access, because for us, and ultimately creating shared value is about expanding access to medicines and doing it in new ways probably we didn't even imagine 20 or 30 years ago. We know from WHO estimates there's about 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to adequate health care. We know in the United States, those numbers are around 28% of patients who are under the age of 65 don't have access to the medicines that they need. And nearly 1 in 10 patients in developed countries forego the medicines that they would or could help them. Not acceptable, and we need to do better. And that's a journey that we started to really take seriously at all levels of our company. But our journey is really now about taking a total view of how we tackle access. This is our access pyramid. You can see we have a strategy that we try to take on every single part of the income pyramid. And our hope is by being systematic about this over time, we can really move the needle on access to medicines around the world. But let me take you on the journey, and hopefully there's some insights that you gather from our journey, because I think it's probably similar to many other companies that you have heard about or are in the room. So our journey really started in the 1970s, where we began to take on leprosy. We donate the entire global supply of leprosy medicines in the world to treat leprosy. And we've been doing it now for 30 years. We've donated 60 million courses to date, treated over 7 million people. Our efforts were really to try to eliminate the disease. We've gotten closer. Most countries in the world no longer have leprosy as a disease. It's probably not something we would ever talk about in a place like Boston. Still, there are cases we find in India and Brazil, and we're continuing to work on that. Our goal is ultimately to eliminate leprosy from the planet. And we continue to stay the course with significant donations that we continue to make year over year. Then we said, you know what, donations may not be the answer. We need to come up with a more sustainable model, because in trying to do donations, we limited our reach and we eliminated the economic sustainability of our ability to invest to really enable access to happen. So we moved to what we thought of was cost-neutral approaches to providing medicines. And this is an image with malaria. We've become really one of the global leaders in tackling malaria. In 1993, we began work with a Nobel Prize winner in China to start to develop artemisinin. Artemisinin now is the basis of almost all anti-malarials given in Africa. In 2000, when the drug was licensed, we committed to providing as much anti-malarials as would be needed at cost to patients in poor countries around the world. To date, we've given out 880 million courses of our medicines across Africa and across Asia, all at cost. We recently had the head of the Medicines for Malaria Ventures from the Gates Foundation visit our campus, talking about the impact that we've had through our work in malaria. Our pediatric formulation that we launched in 2012, he estimated, has probably saved 1 million children's lives in the last 7 years. So remarkable impact from such a program, but still limited. I mean, still we are limiting ourselves to the world of infectious disease. We're still in the world of leprosy and malaria. Now we continue this work to date. We are developing 2 new drugs for malaria, the only 2 new approaches to malaria currently in the clinic. I had the opportunity to visit those clinical trial sites in Africa. The trials are going well, but we know we needed to do more. So we evolved again. And actually, before going to the next evolution, this is just a picture. This is the group of people who have been working on this project since 1993. They meet every year in Kenya. A remarkable group in that it's a group of Chinese scientists, a group of East African physicians, and some Novartis people in the middle, who have worked together for 25 years to keep bringing anti-malarials to tackle this disease across Africa. And as I said, a Nobel Prize was awarded for the scientific basis for this work. So then we moved to a project called Healthy Families, which Professor Kramer has actually written about, also called Rogia Parivar. The goal of this project was, how do we actually improve village healthcare from the bottom up? How do we use village health workers to educate, improve diagnosis, and then provide low-cost solutions to these patients so that they can manage their disease? It was started in India, and we began by reaching 10 million, then eventually 20 million. Now we reach close to 40 million people across Southeast Asia, East Africa, and India with these efforts. In effect, we train and work with the village health workers. We create special medicines packages for the availability in the villages. And we're actually now turned a profit on this effort. It took us, I think, roughly 5 to 7 years to break even, and now it's actually a self-sustaining operation that's able to bring healthcare to all of these 40 million people. It's an effort we continue to expand, but again, there was a limitation. The limitation is we're still using relatively rudimentary approaches to care, simple things that we can get to the front line to villagers across these regions. So we took a bold effort about 2-3 years ago with something called Novartis Access. Novartis Access was our next stage and really on this journey of shared value. Novartis Access aims to bring medicines for chronic diseases, and as I hope we all know right now, the challenge in lower income countries and lower middle income countries is no longer infectious disease. The demographic transition has happened. This is definitely all about non-communicable diseases. And so our goal was to bring approximately 30 medicines at $1 a course per month to these countries, and do it through agreements with governments. And the idea would we could accelerate, we hoped, access to medicines for non-communicable diseases. To date, we have agreements with Pakistan, Nigeria, Colombia, El Salvador. We're also working with countries such as Rwanda and across other countries in Africa. Our goal is to get 30 countries onto the program. And we rigorously evaluate, is this actually improving access to medicines in non-communicable diseases? And we publish the results. We work with Boston University. The results have been published in The Lancet. And the results have been mixed, because on the one hand, while we can show that our medicines show up in the clinics, we can't show that actually utilization or true access yet is happening, because we need to increase the overall performance of the healthcare infrastructure to diagnose these patients and get them the medicines they need. But again, another step in our journey. Now last year, I think we took the ultimate step in our journey, in that we launched the Novartis Access Principles, which holds me as CEO, my executive team, all to account to ensure every new innovation that we bring to market, we have a plan prior to launch to enable access to that medicine to countries around the world within 1 year. This is one of the, at least in our industry, one of the more bolder commitments one can make. Historically, it could take 15 years for a new innovation, let's say in heart failure or cancer, to reach patients in Rwanda or Kenya, or in many cases even India. And so the goal here is quite bold, and it's a goal that starts in R&D, where we commit ourselves to think in R&D about how will we make access happen. We have teams come and present to the executive committee to actually put forward how will they ensure that this happens in a very rapid way. And I'd like to show you some of the examples of how we're actually making this happen in practice. Probably our most successful approach has been something called emerging market brands. Emerging market brands take a brand, and the classic example I'll give you is a drug called Entresto. It's a heart failure breakthrough that we have all around the world. But what we've done is created a low-cost emerging market brand that enables that medicine to be available now across Africa and India, as well as in Latin America. The emerging market brands have been incredibly successful for us. They, on the one hand, create affordable access to these medicines. On the other hand, they expand markets for us to create a sustainable healthcare ecosystem. Actually, we raise the standard of care as physicians learn about what is the best therapy for their patients. We now have 60 such brands. In some cases, we have more volume from our emerging market brands than we do from our developed or European and US markets. So quite a remarkable achievement. We expect in India alone, we will soon be able to reach more heart failure patients than we do in the United States and Europe. So it's been a big success story for us and something we're looking to expand. Some of the other things we've learned along the way of doing emerging market brands, looking at accelerated access and managed access initiatives, is how our medicines might be used to tackle other challenges that exist in different regions of the world. I'd like to take you through two such examples. One is Chagas disease, another disease of Latin America. Chagas disease is transmitted by is a parasitic disease transmitted by a bug called the reduvid bug, which lives in mud block homes. It's actually still quite a problem in Brazil and throughout much of South America. What we realized is one of our heart failure medicines actually can perhaps help treat these patients for the cardiovascular complications, the heart complications of this disease. So we decided to start studying it. So in a first of its kind effort, we are running clinical trials now in Latin America to see if a heart failure medicine might be able to tackle a very local challenge of Chagas disease in South America. And so these are some of the patients that we're working with, and as part of the clinical trial, we're hopeful that it'll be a solution. It'll be the first medicine to really take on the complications of what is a really devastating disease in Latin America. We also have taken on, I think, probably our boldest challenge yet, which is to tackle a chronic hematological disease, a chronic blood disease in West Africa. We have the second largest oncology and hematology medicines organization in the world. But we've never really been able to tackle the challenge of bringing those medicines to Africa. We know that sickle cell disease has its highest incidence in West Africa, with close to 5% of births with children with sickle cell disease. And today, most of those children are just left to die. There are no treatments available. They're often underdiagnosed. So through a very bold initiative we've signed with the president of Ghana, we are taking on, working with Ghana to put in place a newborn screening program where every child in Ghana would get screened for sickle cell disease. We then worked with our generics division to create a low-cost medicine called hydroxyurea, along with antibiotics, to provide that at a very low, affordable cost to the healthcare system, and then enable, hopefully, these children to be chronically treated and not have to die. And then the hope will be over time we can bring the next wave of technology. So we've actually now started doing our sickle cell clinical trial research in Ghana. Again, first of its kind effort to really take high-tech medicine and bring it into these countries to enable their healthcare systems to develop and tackle what is a very addressable disease. Sickle cell patients in the United States now can live into their 60s or even later. We want that same world for patients in Ghana. Along the way, we do some cool stuff. One of them is working with Zipline. Zipline is, I hope some of you have heard about it, it's a drone-based system that started in Rwanda to deliver blood across Rwanda and make it much more efficient. We now partner with Zipline in Ghana to get the medicines I just described, along with the Ghanaian government, across Ghana, and to really leapfrog the infrastructure challenge of how do you get medicines, how do you manage cold chain in these environments. So stay tuned. I think drone-based delivery in Africa is something that's going to become quite important for us to tackle these challenges. Now, we also learn as we go. So, along with taking on these big challenges in global health, we also are a company that's pioneering work in gene and cell therapies to try to bring one-time cures to patients. This is Matteo. Matteo is a little boy with SMA type 1. Now, the normal disease course of SMA type 1 is 90 to 100% of children die in the first 2 years of life. Those that survive with less severe forms of SMA 2-3 are bedridden, typically, are on constant ventilatory, so lung support and feeding tubes. They often are on chronically going in and out of the hospital. And one of the most devastating things when you meet these children is mentally they are developing normally, but physically they're losing the ability to use any of the muscles in the body. And eventually they succumb. So SMA 2-3 patients typically live to 25 years of age. So Matteo received a single dose of a gene therapy at the age of 3 months of age, a little earlier, 2 months of age. He now walks and he goes to school. It is one of the most remarkable things I've seen in medicine, and I've been working in drug development, as you heard, for over 14 years, in vaccines and medicines. It is remarkable that a single dose could potentially cure a child like Matteo. And so we're working on this with the question of how do we bring access to such a medicine to US, Europe, and then eventually to other countries. We've done it already once with another medicine called Kymriah. Kymriah is a medicine where children who are at their end stage of cancer therapy, who face certain death within 45 days, we were able to cure 90% of them of their cancer. It's one of the few places in cancer where we can create cures. Here's the problem. When you have a single dose of a medicine, how do you value it? You have a system where the system is happy to pay for medicines for $7 million, $10 million over 20 or 30 years. But suddenly all that value creation is coming down to a single moment. And having that dialogue and being able to describe that and explain that to policymakers in the US and Europe, and then determining how can we provide access to that to patients all around the world is one of the great challenges we're now tackling. We take it seriously, we're quite determined, and we're quite determined to do everything we do based on a value-based framework, to actually analytically assess what is the value we create and how can we share that value. Half that value at least is what we say with society. We did that with Kymriah. Our goal is to do the same with gene therapies. But it shows you the arc of where we want to go if we really want to live our access principles every day. Now, of course, we work on patient assistance programs in the US to reach hundreds of thousands of patients. That's a big part of our journey as well. And maybe the last point I'd want to make before inviting Lauren back on stage is the biggest lever I think we actually have to do this at a company as big as ours, and that's our cultural transformation. We're trying to transform a company that we used to be quite hierarchical and top-down, into what we call an inspired, curious, and unbossed organization. We are no longer bosses, we're all servant leaders. The bosses are gone, and to be successful at our company, you have to be an unboss. You have to be all about setting an inspiring vision, really inspiring your people around purpose, trying to motivate them to be curious about what's possible, and then removing obstacles for the people, enable them to do their work. It's a powerful concept, hard to do, I can tell you, across 100,000 people. But I believe if we're going to really live our goal of reimagining medicine, we're going to have to reimagine Novartis, every element of Novartis, to enable that new trajectory. And then we're also going to have to reimagine all of ourselves as leaders. And as I like to tell our organization, reimagining ourselves as leaders starts with me. So thanks very much. I look forward to hearing your questions.
I told you it was going to be great, right? There's so many questions I have based on what you just were talking about. And let me just start off with asking you about the reimagining access piece that you were just describing. A mentor once told me that, or shared with me, Paul Wise is his name, that when you have something that's really effective, like the treatments you talked about, access to it is all the more important because of the level of effectiveness. If you have something that's not that effective, access to it isn't that important because it's not really going to change sort of the outcome. So this piece around access and whether or not it can drive disparities, drive the inequities getting bigger if you don't have good access to it, versus the ways you were describing it and the examples that you were giving with your heart medications as an example, could actually create a situation where their equity is developed as a real meaningful outcome. Can you talk a little bit about how you got the company, or how the company came to see access as so important, and how do you continue to include that in how you're thinking about your work?
Yeah, well, the first part of the journey has been having the courage, and I think leaders have to have the courage to start with purpose and belief deeply that the purpose of the company is what people want to talk about, and that the numbers will follow. I always tell our people, it's about the faces, it's about the impact. It's not about the numbers. The numbers will come as they come. And so once you start that dialogue, that's the first step. And then I think once we got to that place to say, look, our purpose is to reimagine medicine, and what is that really going to take? We started down this journey of really taking on access. It's not easy, I can tell you. If you think about when we develop a new breast cancer medicine, and then we have to approach a team and say, look, we want you to not just think about how you're going to launch that medicine in the US, but how are you going to improve breast cancer screening rates in Southern Africa? The team has not been asked to do that before, and that's a whole new challenge. And of course, the playbook does not exist, and now you're in a whole new place. So I think it's going to be a journey, but I think it's going to be the consistency, and it's going to be about measuring it, really measuring how we're actually tackling it. So but the interesting thing is how inspired the organization is around it. I mean, what I have found is shifting to a purpose-driven dialogue for a company like ours. In the end, we're 100,000 people who want to change the world, right? That's what people come to work every day wanting to do. I believe firmly that what motivates an individual is a sense of purpose, a sense of curiosity, and a sense of empowerment. And if you have those three things, that far exceeds the power of any monetary or carrots or sticks or anything you can offer. So if you really tap into that, and our access journey taps into that, you can get a lot of energy from the company.
Well, you touched on and used the word purpose, and we've been really wrestling with that and teasing that apart over the last day and this morning, as you heard Carlos talk about his work. How has the corporate purpose really contributed to, well, let me back up and say, how have you been able to incorporate the purpose into everything that you're doing? You talked about, like, you're asking folks to think about how's this work going to be applicable elsewhere. How have you been able to galvanize your team, their teams, to be able to kind of take this into how they're thinking about their work if they haven't had to do it before?
You know, the biggest part of that journey is to be comfortable moving from a world of logic, logos, to a world of magic. And I use the word of magic deliberately, because you're trying to tap into somebody's emotions. Every time we talk about our purpose, I like to talk about the grand journey that you saw, the grand journey to improve human health, that to reflect for a moment that there's only been 1,500 medicines ever found, period. And we're one of 3 companies that's found over 100, and that's pretty remarkable. So when people start to feel that sense of what they do is somehow magical and contributing to society in significant ways, it's actually pretty easy once you're willing. The harder part is getting leaders to stand up on stage and be comfortable doing that. And it's not enough if I do it. We have 18,000 people managers at Novartis. I need at least a third of them to be willing to get up on stage and inspire and appeal to purpose. I try to tell our leaders that you have to answer the question why 3 times as much as you answer the question what. Because your people all know what to do. They're asking themselves, why are we here doing it? And so I think that's been the biggest journey. It's really one around leadership and getting leaders to understand that the biggest lever they have is to inspire their people. But that's not a natural reaction. It's much easier to get up there and put up the P&L and walk through the lines.
Yeah. Will you share the little vignette that you told me about when you have your meetings with your staff, what you show and what you don't show?
Yeah, when we do global town halls, it was a big shift because historically at our company, global town halls, potentially reach 50,000, 70,000 people. We would typically quarterly go through the numbers, go through our financial performance, what was our op inc growth, what was our sales growth. And so from day one as CEO, I tried to take a different tack. I've started with the purpose, talk about the impact we have on patients, the impact and innovation of our medicines, talk about our 5 priorities as a company, and 2 of the top 5 priorities, which also are in our annual reports, we measure them, are on culture change and building trust with society as 2 top priorities, along with things like operational excellence and innovation. And then believe the numbers will follow. But people aren't inspired by talking about the numbers. They're inspired when they get to talk about the impact they have on the world. So at first, I remember my finance organization was horrified I was going to do this.
Can you just imagine the new CEO coming in like, oh, we have a new CEO, and we're not going to say anything about the P&L.
So
Did they freak out?
They were horrified. They tried many ways to stop me. One of the good things about being CEO is in the end I get to decide. So and actually
you are the boss. So
maybe that was a boss moment. And in the end, now that's all we do. I mean, actually, we just had one, and we talked about the impact of our recent innovations. We had teams talk about some of the things they're working on from all around the world, whether it's a packaging line at a manufacturing site or a field team in the United States. We had Adam Grant come in and talk to us about how do you make great cultures and great companies that are all about giving and collaborating internally. And that was the meeting. And people walk away feeling inspired, motivated to have an impact.
Yeah. You mentioned impact, and I'm going to open it up after this next question, but I would really love, I have a sense that people would really want to hear from you. How have you approached evaluating both the business impact as well as the social impact? Because I think one of the challenges that many folks face is they may have that team of people who come over to really believe it, but they have to make the case to so many other stakeholders who are used to assessing impact or seeing impact in a different way. So I'm curious how you all have approached that.
So when we put together these 5 strategies, 5 pillars of our strategy, we also committed to measuring all 5 pillars. So as I said, they're in our annual report. We have to come up with metrics that are auditable by our auditors, and we figure out ways. We're still working on it. If you're trying to measure culture change, you're trying to measure how are you building more trust with society, how are you really creating access to medicines. You have to work hard to figure out what those metrics are, and then we publish the metrics. So we put out for this year our Novartis and Society report, and every one of these 5 areas we put out metrics on how we're going to measure. It's also in our annual report. One of the remarkable journeys for me in going that direction has been with our investors. With our investors, I remember when I first, again, another funny moment, when I wanted to go in and meet all of our buy-side investors and our roadshow, I told the IR team I'm going to start with culture, and I'm also going to highlight what we're going to try to do to build trust with society. And I can tell you again, I had perplexed looks on the faces. I mean, they were really asking themselves, are you really? And they thought I was joking. And I still do it today. I start with where are we on the culture change journey? What are we doing in terms of providing access to medicines? And the interesting thing is most long investors know. They know that companies that have strong, purpose-driven cultures are the ones that outperform. That is actually the truth. They're just so shocked that anyone would actually come in and talk to them about those things because they're so used to hearing about the quarterly numbers when I think savvy long-term investors know companies with great cultures are the ones that win.
Yeah. Well, I'm 100% sure that there are folks in the audience that have a lot of questions that they want to share with you. So we'll have a few minutes to do that. So we'll take that. Yeah, here we go.
Thank you. Very informational and inspirational. So I work for PSI. which you may know. For those of you who don't know, PSI is an international public health nonprofit. We've been in 50 countries, low and middle income countries, for going on 50 years. Our purpose is to expand access to healthcare products and services through market development. So very similar to Novartis, but as an NGO, we have a very different business model. So I'm just curious your perspective on NGOs in our kind of shared purpose, but with different models. Do you see them as a partner? How can they help you? Or perhaps more provocatively, do they not have a role in partnership, given we receive donor funds that can often undercut markets through subsidy and donations of products and services?
Yeah, you know, in most of the countries and most of the stories I told there was, of course, a network of local partners, many of them from NGOs, whether it was PSI, John Snow, others that had deep expertise working locally. Because I think particularly on the elements of improving the healthcare system infrastructure, that's not our expertise. I mean, what we can provide is funding to do that. We can provide medicines at affordable costs, but we're not experts in doing that at all. So whether it's examples like our efforts in Ghana in hypertension, or we have efforts in many parts of the world trying to improve hypertension care or cancer screening, we always work through local partners. I think for us the key has been to figure out how to have partners who are there for the long run, because like as you saw, I mean, in some of these countries, you know, we've been there for 100 years, and so we plan to be there for 100 more years. So we need partners who are going to stay the course.
Great. Yes. Here. Press it, or either that, or use your mom voice.
Hello. There we go. Hi. Thanks. Such an inspiring discussion. I'm Erin. I'm with Novo Nordisk, actually. I'm just curious to go a little bit deeper on the investor relations part that you were just talking about. So it's something that I think is a hot topic in these walls all the time, every year, around shared value, and obviously with Larry Fink's letter. But what is the reaction? Are they truly embedded in what you said and talking more and wanting to learn more, or is it a great opener to then get you to more of the numbers and the traditional thinking that investors want to know about?
So I think right now where I've had a lot of traction in these discussions is around culture change, more than shared value per se. I mean, I think in terms of explaining to investors that if you look at it, inspired, engaged organizations that are inspired by purpose consistently outperform, no matter if you look at HBR, you look at in various studies that have been done by the management consulting firms, that seems to be a truth. And yet most organizations don't spend a lot of time thinking about how they're going to create that culture. So that culture change element, I think, has a lot of traction with investors. I think on the topic of ESG shared values, it's right now much more of how do you protect against a downside. I mean, we all know that MSCI and all of the various ESG rating organizations play a role insofar as investors can invest in your company if you're below a certain threshold. But being great at it doesn't make them more likely to invest in your company. It's more of a floor phenomenon. So we were ranked second in the Access to Medicines Index, something I'm incredibly proud of. And does an investor really care? They're just happy I'm not 20. Because if I was 20, it would be a problem because their ESG group would come and say you can't invest. So I think that's more the dynamic I see. But that said, it is becoming a very big part of the conversation, I think, that investors have to be cognizant of how a company is creating value more broadly in society. And I think the better we get at measuring it, that's really going to help.
Right, the measuring piece.
Yeah. Hello. Can you comment on the role of governance in the board of directors in moving in this direction of strategic social enterprise?
Yeah. So you have to have your board with you, for sure. I think I have a board that's been very supportive of the move we made when I started as CEO. Probably if I were to say the culture change was harder because it's such a counterintuitive thing to say I don't want bosses, I want unbosses, and everyone in the room looks at you like you're crazy. Everyone's going to.
That seems to be a theme in what you've shared with us this morning.
Exactly contrarian. And that people fear, but as one person, as Adam Grant rightfully said, you either believe people in the world are fundamentally lazy, unmotivated, and unless you constantly are on top of them with carrots and sticks, that's the only way to motivate. Or you believe people in the world are fundamentally motivated by something higher, a higher purpose. And you have to decide. And most organizations, I think, are over-indexing on the first, and if you can appeal to the second. So getting the board of directors on that journey was harder. I think on the society and wanting to do more for society, I think the key was putting together a framework and really being clear about the framework and how we're going to measure it. Within our work to build trust with society, we have 5 pillars. We have benchmarks on all of them that we measure ourselves. So pricing and access, as I just described, global public health, leprosy, malaria, Chagas disease, as I told you, environmental and social targets, whether that's the environment, whether that's gender diversity, whether that's LGBTI rights, all of those elements. Ethics and compliance, which I think is now part and parcel, and how do we communicate the value proposition of the company? How do we really show we're doing all these things? As long as I could articulate that clearly, I think the board of directors was along. But you have to get your board on board with you. Very difficult otherwise, I think.
Yeah. I know we had someone over here.
Yeah, hi, Vas, Alan Murray. Can you talk a little bit more about how you work with that access value cost equation, which is difficult, I think, for people to get their heads around? That amazing SMA drug that you were talking about, sure. There were reports yesterday that it may be priced as high as $2 million. How do you think about access for a small population drug like that has to carry such a high cost to cover your development costs?
Yeah, I just believe we have to be very analytical about this. When you think about cost effectiveness analysis and the various benchmarks we have to measure value, we can assess what is the cost of not having such an intervention or the cost of the existing interventions. We know that depending on the situation, a transplant in this country can cost $3 million. A chronic care for enzyme replacement therapy for children, which you would know from pediatrics for various enzyme replacement therapies over 10 years can cost $8 to $10 million. The existing standards of care for this therapy cost $4 to $5 to $6 million. And so we're actually giving back value to society in the pure monetary value sense. It's just that from a mental standpoint, our world is used to looking at therapies that are given over decades. And suddenly now it's at one moment in time. We had this journey with Kymriah, the cancer medicine I talked to you about. Independent groups, not completely independent, certainly not supportive always of our industry's approaches, said the medicine was cost effective at $875,000 in infusion. And we priced it at $375,000. But with great respect to the media, it's a great story, right, to say $375,000, but not put the other number, not put it in context, to say actually, an independent group said from a value standpoint, it should have been priced at $875,000. And that to me is a great challenge we have with these one-time therapies. And it's very important we sort it out, because I think we would all agree we'd rather have a cure, right? Would you rather have Matteo trying to work through ventilation and nasogastric tubes and going in and out of or get a single infusion? And then, we have children now in our newborn screening studies that I hope, may never know they had SMA. They got screened, they get a single infusion, they're cured for life. They never know they had SMA, a disease that would have otherwise, and you've seen SMA patients. This is a horrible, horrible disease. And that's going to be possible for a whole range of conditions. But we have to figure out how to have a dialogue between price and value in what has become a very polarized environment.
Thank you. We have time for one more.
Hi, Monica Sanders here. Really quick question. So you talked about the need for a cultural shift within your organization. My question is, with the servant leadership model that you've just discussed, what about the structural changes that you had? What changes have you had to make in the way groups in the organization is formed?
Yeah,
That's a
often
short
get this.
answer.
I often get this question. I'll try to be quick. So it's a major undertaking if you want to change the culture of a more or less 250-year-old, 100,000 person organization in 150 countries. Not straightforward at all. The first thing is you have to be consistent and be consistent for years. I plan to be consistent about it for 5, 7, 10, however long I have this role, to keep incredibly consistent about the culture and leadership expectations. And then we have 3 approaches that we've taken. First is to build broad-scale awareness of the new culture, and really social media provides you a whole new opportunity. So we've become, in 14 months, there's an online platform Microsoft uses called Yammer. It's sort of like a Facebook at work kind of thing. We went from being 1,000 people and not a notable user. Now we are the largest user of Yammer in the world. We have, I think, 90,000 people on the system, 50,000 active users, posting stories of the work they do, whether it was in West Africa, Brazil, Malaysia, every day. And we are constantly talking about what is the culture that we want to create through that channel. So it's one example, we have a few others, of how now you can reach your base unlike you couldn't before. You don't have to work through all the layers of the organization to get that purpose culture message. You can go straight to the front line, and you can talk to a sales rep anywhere at Novartis, or a manufacturing worker, or a research associate. They know unboss. They know the word unboss. They may not know what it means, which is a separate problem, but they know that this is the goal. The second is to create a much stronger understanding within our leaders. So we've invested a lot in leadership development. We're heavily investing on our top 300 leaders. We're investing heavily as well in our top 1,000 leaders to really get them to understand the leadership change. And then we're using a lot of tools to try to measure as we go. So we use Glint. Glint we rolled out to 18,000 associates, 18,000 managers. They all received upward feedback from their team. And they didn't have a choice because the app just did it, and they all had the app pushed to their phones. And actually we've had 80% of managers look at their scores to understand how did they lead. And so all of these are different strategies. We have a whole team working on it. I mean, the most important thing is that you have the top team engaged and owning it. So I personally chair our culture transformation effort. This is not something I gave to HR and said, let me know how it goes. I think the leader has to own it.
Great. Please join me in thanking
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.